I've been seeing a lot of people sort of discussing what's better, comics or manga. And as someone who's been reading both of these mediums for quite a long time, obviously some people are going to have their biases and they're super similar. So there's not really a huge difference. But I just wanted to point out the one definitive difference that I would say is prevalent in comics and manga. And no, it's not you read one left to right and you read the other right to left. The main difference that I would say is the perception of the medium, and from that, the consumption of the characters in the medium as well. See, comics have been around for such a long time, obviously decades more than manga. And obviously at the start, comics were really simple because they were just made to be sort of episodic adventures of characters without really any depth. The main appeal of these characters was the fantasy, the sort of self-insert idea of I am this adventurer, I am this really cool person that's able to do all these things, or not even the self-insert, but I am watching cool person do cool things in cool adventure. Essentially, comics were meant to be almost like an action movie is. Ironically enough, one of the most selling comics of all time is literally Action Comics, which is the first ever appearance of Superman. And I'll be talking about him quite a bit in this video. Personally, I feel as though people who say that comics are better or manga is better it's very disingenuous, because both of the mediums obviously have characters that are meant to be more action focused, not really that much depth to them. For example, a series I really enjoy that I would say does not have that much depth in the character building is Fist of the North Star. Obviously there is some lore in Fist of the North Star, but the main appeal is Kenshiro being cool, killing people, in really grotesque ways. And that's really it. A lot of people don't really care about the lore of the series. There is stuff there, obviously, but in reality, people just care about the cool post-apocalyptic lone warrior sort of angle to it, because it evokes some sort of masculinity, some sort of niche, interesting aura, And there's other series as well, like much older series that sort of just tell interesting stories without having a defined lore for the characters. A lot of Tezuka's work is very much like this, where you can see that characters aren't even really characters. They're more so just roles that are in the story, which is shown through his sort of actor kind of aspect that he used to do with a lot of his work, where certain characters would play as different series characters, if that makes sense. It's a bit convoluted, so I don't want to get too in depth on that regard, but that's just an example. Many manga just focus on very specific things, while obviously as the genre has developed, more plot focused things have been happening since they've become more long-standing, long-focused plots. As you can see, the appeal of it is the instant sort of, you want this, here you go, aspect of it all. And that's what I think many people sort of misinterpret about comics and manga. I feel as though many people put manga on a higher pedestal because of the amount of consumption in a story you can get, when in reality there's a lot of comics with really in-depth lore. Like, I know this is a pretty obvious example, but Saga is a very highly reputable comic series, and there's so much lore. And like, there's so many others, like Invincible, obviously that's super new and getting popular again. The Boys, obviously that's getting popular because of the TV show. The Walking Dead is a massive global franchise now. There are so many examples of comics with really in-depth lore and characters and everything. And, you can get the consumption from it. Obviously, you get more invested. But the problem with that is that a lot of those series at this point are just getting popular with the sort of rise of the genre itself. In the past, a lot of comics were like stuff like Archie or Superman or Batman, where it's very, here is the main character, here is what they do, here is how they do it. And there's not really much growth from there. Something I thought was really interesting, getting back on the topic of Superman, was the entire idea that Superman never had this whole Clark Kent farm boy origin story for decades. Batman never had his family getting killed in that alleyway for decades. And I think it's absolutely fascinating that these characters that are so intrinsically tied with these plot elements never had them before, because the writers didn't want people to get too overwhelmed by the plot that they would need to remember. I think it's actually really interesting. And there are other comics as well that focus on the simplicity of it all. I think a really good example is Tintin, which is just sort of a detective adventure sort of story where this young boy travels the world to see all this cool stuff. And it gets, personally, really investing. I think it's really cool to see all the sort of antics he gets into, all the fun characters he meets, and it's just fun. There's not something I really need to get into. I guess another manga in this example would be Doraemon, which is all about the cool gadgets, the fun characters, the wacky settings, and all the stuff they get into. I think having series like this, where you don't really need to follow a strong plot or some sort of long-standing narrative, is important. Obviously, it's just fun. It's enjoyable. And you can just put it on, and people who don't really understand won't get the full gist of it, but it's still enjoyable to an extent where, you could just watch it anytime and any episode, any order, and you won't really miss out on much. And that's part of the whole appeal of this entire thing. Many people, again, put manga in this sort of elitist position because of this. How many manga have more long-standing narratives now, especially because Shonen Jump has these massive series like that span hundreds and hundreds of chapters. Literally, there's these massive omnibuses of series that just keep going forever. But the thing is, manga is written by one person for the most part. American comics, what they do is they usually have a group of people or different writers who want to interpret a character in their own way. And this interpretation of the character goes along with the line of consumption. I feel as though America and American comics as a culture, specifically, Marvel, DC, stuff like that, really wants readers to get invested and new readers specifically to be brought into the series, because there's a ton of superheroes that these characters are able to be portrayed with, and lots of new characters that they want to introduce. So having that ability to sort of just reboot it constantly allows for new people to get invested, see these characters, and if they're invested in this character, they can look through the decades prior of all the stuff they've been in and learn more about them. And through that, they can learn more about other characters and other characters. Comics feel like a massive, well, specifically Marvel and DC, a massive web where, say you like Green Lantern, right? That's more of a not obvious example, but he's popular. Say you like Green Lantern. You go back and you learn he's with this whole team, this massive team with Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Cyborg, and you're like, wait, these characters are pretty cool. And that leads to so many other things just instantaneously, and that's definitely part of the appeal. Obviously, you don't have to get too invested in it, but if you do and you want to, you realize there's so much more than just this surface appearance. And I think that is really what hooks a lot of people. Now, I will say that personally, these reboots and sort of new narratives can be a bit confusing. I'm not going to lie. That's why a lot of people have sort of migrated to the MCU, not only because it's massively popular, but because that seemingly has this long-standing narrative that is not going to get altered for now. I assume that the dimension stuff that's going on is going to change that quite a bit, but you know how it is. I'm definitely just saying that many people preferred the MCU because of the consistency that it was sort of garnering, the literal universe it was building off of this pre-established stuff to create some sort of stable continuity. Now, some people were annoyed by changes, but copyright stuff, you can't do anything about that at the moment. Maybe they'll change it. Highly doubt it, but it is what it is. So, what I'm getting at is that these reboots and sort of continuing narratives with no distinct timeline can get pretty confusing, especially since some characters have lasted for decades and decades and decades. I can't even imagine telling someone, where do you start with Spider-Man? Well, it's kind of hard. Essentially, because of this lack of consumption, you need the plot. You don't really need that sort of narrative through line for these characters. You just need to know the gist of the character, some basic things, and you can just read essentially whatever. And that's what I think is a very different market than manga. Obviously, manga has a specific author, a specific source that it tries to go with, and that's really it for the most part. There hasn't been a manga that I can think of from my experience reading that has had multiple authors or multiple points of view or even a reboot at all. American comics, well, again, I've mostly read Marvel for most of my childhood, and I did delve into some Image comics, but Marvel has had tons of reboots even while I was reading it, and it's a bit hard to comprehend. So obviously there is that. However, that's not a negative. That's obviously a large insight to people's just interest. Say, let's go back to Green Lantern. Say DC, after the New 52 reboot, made another Green Lantern series. Now, that might be a bit annoying for people who liked the New 52 reboot, and that's obviously understandable because, say, they like that narrative. Again, I'm just going to be straight up. I don't read DC very often. I'm just saying that specific universe Green Lantern. So, I don't know if people enjoy or not enjoy it. I'm just saying that as an example. So, say there's a Green Lantern series after that reboot. People might not enjoy it as much because they prefer the previous narrative, and that's fine. Totally understandable. However, this new narrative of Green Lantern allows new people to come in, get invested in the character, and delve more into the character himself. And I think that's really important because I know specifically from example, but saying, oh, you should get into this, it just started, or you should get into this, there's only about like 10 chapters out, I think it's really enjoyable, is a lot easier to kind of pull people in than, hey, you should read One Piece. It's 1,000 chapters long, but it's so good. Now, obviously, I love One Piece, but there is some clarity to what I just said. It's definitely a bit more of a struggle to pull people into One Piece when, you know, that investment is a big overwhelming mountain to people. And instead of just, a 10 chapter new series coming out off of a character they've probably heard of before. So, again, the only difference I would say, realistically, between American comics and manga are the ideals of consuming the characters themselves. And even that is not that big of a difference, because many manga have had this sort of ideal of consuming a character. Essentially, both the genres and both the medias have this ability to have series that have long-standing narratives and short narratives that are rebooted or not really plot focused. So either way, you should be able to find something you really, really enjoy. And I feel as though people who have a sort of disdain for one or the other obviously are just having their bias sort of cloud the potential of the mediums themselves. So yeah, those are my thoughts on comics versus manga, that whole debate. Personally, I've been meaning to make this video for quite a while. It's just, something I've really been passionate about since I've read the two for quite a bit at this point. And I just wanted to get my thoughts out because I've been thinking about it quite a lot lately. I'm literally in a superhero film and genre class at the moment, so this sort of ideal of consumption has been really fresh in my mind, and I kind of wanted to get my thoughts out about it and give some of the information I learned in that class in the video as well. Like learning about the Superman and Batman lore stuff where they never had their backstories was actually pretty crazy, growing up when they only had their backstories and Batman's backstory was like his whole motivation. I can't even imagine what Batman was like without it. It was probably explain why the 60s show was a lot more cheesy and campy than the more edgy Batman we have now. Really, really interesting stuff. So I'm curious, what do you think? Do you prefer comics or manga? Let me know below, and I hope you enjoyed the video.